I'll move straight to the bulk of the paper, except to say that the Declaration was a carefully worded, much debated paragraph. It was the product of a lengthy and complicated process. Here are some of the main reasons advanced by historians and others to explain why Prime Minister David Lloyd George's government made the Declaration at all. First of all, they say that some members of the cabinet and of the Foreign Office had genuine sympathy for the Jewish people, and they call such people philo-Semites. Secondly, an overlapping group, often overlapping at any rate, of cabinet ministers and foreign secretary mandarins who took satisfaction in expediting the fulfillment of biblical prophecy with regard to Jews returning to Palestine. And probably Lloyd George and Balfour belonged to this group. Thirdly, and much of this was touched on by Professor Avi Shlaim, by the way, many in the government and in the Foreign Office believed that Britain should secure Palestine precisely because, as Professor Shlaim said, it overlooks Egypt, which contains the Suez Canal, which is the British economic jugular vein, and they thought that a Jewish community of Anglophiles in Palestine would help them to maintain stable government there. Historians also point to a fear that the Germans might get in first and issue a declaration and thereby win Jewish support. And then someone else pointed out the fact that Weitzman himself was an important chemist, and some historians have said that they wanted to somehow thank Weitzman for his contributions to the war effort, and that British policy in Palestine had something to do with that. I believe that these explanations all touch on the real matter but are not determining factors. And in my opinion, the main reason that the Lloyd George government released the Declaration was because it believed that by doing so, it would help them to win World War I. And that stems from the great misconception, anti-Semitic misconception, held by many members of the government and the Foreign Office, that Jews exercised a vast subterranean influence over world affairs, and that they had control of the banks and of finance more generally, and simultaneously and quite contradictorily, that they controlled the world socialist movement. And so, one of the greatest achievements of Chaim Weitzman was to take advantage of these fundamental misconceptions. Weitzman, of course, was a Russian-born chemist, trained largely in Switzerland, had become a reader in chemistry at the University of Manchester, and it is this individual who emerged during World War I as the indispensable Zionist leader in Britain. And Weitzman was a master of what I think can best be termed political jujitsu. He used his opponent's weapons to benefit himself and his movement. So, the anti-Semites in the government and in the Foreign Office said, "You Jews control banking," and Weitzman said, "You're right, we do." And they said, "You control world socialism," and he said, "Yes, it's true. The Jews have vast powers. Yes, we do, and you need us." Now, previously, leaders of the Jewish community in Great Britain had been assimilationists. Their ablest and most prominent advocate was a journalist called Lucien Wolfe. And the assimilationists argued that Judaism is a belief system, and it can be practiced wherever Jews live. And certainly in liberal, tolerant Britain, Jews can practice their religion and can become as accepted as any other practitioner of a dissenting religion, a non-Anglican religion. They will become Jews who happen to live in Britain, not, did I get that right? Jews who happen to live in Britain, not people who live in Britain who are Jews, right? British first, Jews second. But Weitzman and the Zionists had a completely different message. They argued that anti-Semitism is ineradicable and that Jews cannot assimilate in Great Britain or, in fact, anywhere. They cannot assimilate in France or the United States, let alone a country like Russia or Romania. And Jews who think that assimilation is possible are deluded. They're fooling themselves, and therefore they need their own country, their own home, and that could be nowhere else than Palestine, which had been, of course, the location of a great civilization millennia before. Weitzman did not speak publicly about a Jewish state in Palestine during 1914-18, as you just actually indicated. He knew that was too ambitious and would alienate too many potential allies. Of course, I'm sure he always had in mind that there would be someday a Jewish state in Palestine, but they didn't speak about it publicly during World War I. Instead, what he did, was to call for the Allies in the war to defeat the Ottoman Empire, and then for Britain to establish a protectorate in Palestine and permit unrestricted Jewish immigration into Palestine. So Weitzman employed a kind of political jujitsu to turn these anti-Semitic canards to his own advantage. And then secondly, he employed an unrivaled charm, shall we say, to persuade the British governing elite that the Zionists, not the assimilationists, spoke for British Jews. He embarked upon, I think, a very calculated charm offensive to teach the British political elite why it was in their interest to support Zionism. And he was astonishingly successful. He won over C.P. Scott, for example, the proprietor of the Manchester Guardian. He won over Balfour. He won over Lloyd George. At a dinner party held at the home of Lord Reading, another member of the government, somebody said, "We are all Weitzmanites now." So he persuaded the British governing elite not only that Britain needed Jewish support if it was to win the war against Germany, but that it needed Zionist support, because the Zionists, not the assimilationists, spoke for Jewry. And what was it that the Zionists wanted above all? And the answer is Palestine. They wanted a national home in Palestine. So, as a result of Weitzman's political charm offensive and his practice of political jujitsu, the British governing elite came to the conclusion that the way to bring international Jewry, this powerful subterranean element in world affairs, onto their side in the war was to offer them Palestine. And this is an odd but true fact. Those hard-nosed realists, those hard-hearted, hard-headed men in Lloyd George's war cabinet accepted an elementary and absurd anti-Semitic stereotype, which became the most important element in their support for the Balfour Declaration. They thought that American Jews had the power to persuade President Woodrow Wilson to enter the war on the side of the Allies, and they thought that Russian Jews could persuade Kerensky, who had just taken power in February 1917, to continue Russian participation in the war. The British government issued the Balfour Declaration for a number of reasons, as I pointed out earlier, but mainly as a great bribe to world Jewry in order to win World War I. So that's my first main point in this talk. But also there's a great irony in this, if you think for a moment, because they released the Declaration in November, by which time America already had joined the war, so they didn't need to do it for that, and Russia had just been taken over by the Bolsheviks and was going to come out no matter what. So that the Balfour Declaration, which took so long to frame and hone, in the end had nothing to do with who won World War I at all. Britain did emerge victorious, but not because of a declaration based anyway upon an enormous misconception. Now here's my second main point. And this has been alluded to by everyone who's spoken before me. The Balfour Declaration and the process of its development sowed dragon's teeth. And you may know of the Greek myth. In his indignation, Cadmus slew the dragon, and by the advice of Athena sowed its teeth. When they were sown, there rose from the ground armed men. Well, that's what the Balfour Declaration and the process of its development accomplished. With regard to the Declaration, obviously, many Arabs felt betrayed by it. Now, I too know the arguments to the contrary. There is no smoking gun single piece of evidence to show that Britain did promise that Palestine would be part of that independent Arab kingdom. Nevertheless, as Avi Shleim put it, my reading of all the evidence shows me that the Grand Sharif Hussein and his sons believed it would be part of the independent Arab kingdom for which they were fighting. They believed it because of letters they had received from Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, who, by the way, had encouraged them to rebel against the Ottomans. And they had good reason for thinking what they did. McMahon consciously employed what he himself termed nebulous phrases in order to motivate them to launch their rebellion. He was intentionally vague. He explained this in a letter to a very high official at the Foreign Office, Lord Hardinge, quote, "What we have to arrive at now is to tempt the Arab people into the right path, detach them from the enemy, bring them onto our side. This, on our part, is at present largely a matter of words, and to succeed, we must use persuasive terms and abstain from academic haggling over conditions." The Balfour Declaration then disappointed and betrayed Arabs. I think also, actually, British Jewish assimilationists felt betrayed by the Declaration, or at any rate, greatly disappointed, and disappointment and betrayal are related. And I think the assimilationist leaders feel that Lloyd George and the Foreign Office, when it turned their back on them and began speaking to the Zionists instead of them, felt that they had been betrayed. Arguably, however, it was the process leading up to the Declaration that sowed more dragon's teeth than the Declaration itself. Aside from that McMahon-Hussein correspondence that I just referred to, there was this Sykes Picot agreement, which has been referred to already. Sykes and François-Georges Picot of France sat together in a room at the Foreign Office, literally holding crayons and maps, and assuming the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, redrew the map of the Middle East. And they envisioned French control, direct and indirect, of portions of Anatolia and Syria, including northern Palestine, British control of what I think would say is modern-day Iraq, and southern Palestine, and international control of the holy cities in Palestine. Well, when Arab leaders learned about the Sykes Picot agreement, they felt deeply betrayed. They weren't fighting for that. They were fighting for an independent Arabia, including Palestine, as they thought, governed by Sharif Hussein. But the Zionists also felt deeply betrayed by Sykes Picot. Now, they were concerned with Palestine only, and they only wanted a British protectorate there. They thought that if the British controlled Palestine, the British would allow them to maintain their identities as Jews, whereas if the French controlled Palestine, France would insist upon making Jews into Frenchmen. There was never a possibility of, say, Italian control. The Zionists hated the idea of international control, and they would have smiled perhaps on American control, but during World War I, an American protectorate or something of Palestine was not realistic policy. And then, by the way, many British policymakers likewise hated the Sykes-Picot agreement. They thought that Sykes had promised France altogether too much. They wanted all of Palestine for Britain, which, of course, is what eventually happened, which means, if you think about it, that during the war, the British were prepared to betray the Arabs, to betray the Zionists, and to betray their French wartime ally as well. But then, as I realized as I was researching and writing this book about the Declaration, Lloyd George was willing to betray practically anybody, practically any time,
He betrayed his wife.
if it would help him to win World War I. And put yourself in his shoes. 1917, Britain was in a terrible fix. It wasn't clear who would win World War I. Nobody would have confidently predicted that that would be Great Britain. And Lloyd George's job was to get Britain out of this jam. How to do it. So he had another idea. He knew that persuading the Ottoman Empire to quit fighting on Germany's side would do more to help Britain's cause than anything concerning Arabs and Jews. And therefore, while playing with Arabs and Jews, Lloyd George also began to play with the Turks. And doing this led him into very deep and troubled waters indeed. At one point, for complicated reasons that I'm happy to go into later, he simultaneously employed Weitzman to terminate an American mission aiming to sound out the Turks about a separate peace, while simultaneously employing a conservative MP and Turkophile named Aubrey Herbert to go talk to the Turks about a separate peace. On another occasion, early in 1918, he sent Basil Zaharoff, the notorious arms dealer, the original merchant of death, to talk with Turkish emissaries about a separate peace. He offered the Turks inducements to come out of the war, including an enormous financial inducement, $12 million, but also territorial inducements, the most important of which, from our point of view today, was to offer that the Ottoman flag could continue to fly over Palestine if Turkey got out of the war. That's January 1918, 3 months after the Balfour Declaration had been released. In this instance, Lloyd George was betraying Zionists, to whom he had promised Palestine only a few weeks earlier, Arabs, to whom Ottoman control of Palestine would have been at least as objectionable as it would have been to the Zionists, since they were fighting to throw the Turks out. France, he was betraying, which had finally agreed to a British protectorate in Palestine, but not to Turkish control. And here's the clincher. His own foreign secretary, Arthur Balfour, who 2 months earlier had signed the declaration and didn't know about the Zaharoff mission at all. Now, I had thought I had more time than I do, so I will try and end as quickly as I can.
Don't rush too much.
Well, I would put it this way. So much deceit, so much deception could not but lead to terrible repercussions. Many Arabs learned to doubt Britain's word, and since after World War I, Britain was the major imperial power in the Middle East, that meant there was going to be Arab-British conflict. Many Jews learned the same thing through Mark Sykes. They thought they had a friend. Then they learned he was about to betray them through Sykes Picot. And since Jews and Arabs had decided they could rely only upon themselves, and since their interests would come into conflict in Palestine, they could not rely upon Britain to act as their honest broker. And so the reference to the Greek myth seems as clear as day. The Balfour Declaration sowed dragon's teeth. Armed men are still rising from the ground. And here's my last point. Possibly more ominous and even broader lesson to be learned. I was astonished when I was doing the research for this book and when I realized that Lloyd George conducted foreign policy separate at times from the Foreign Office and his own foreign secretary. And I asked diplomatic historian friends, is this possible? Can this happen? And they said, of course it happens all the time. Well, so think about it. A prime minister or a president can follow his star wherever he or she thinks it may lead without consulting his cabinet, without consulting experts. Bad enough when the prime minister was Lloyd George or when it's Theresa May. Terrifying when the president is Donald Trump.